Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, the sex abuse scandal closes in on the Vatican. One Vatican cardinal sentenced to 6 years in prison for abusing choir boys. Another from Washington, D.C., defrocked for decades of being a sexual predator. Victims and investigators ask, what will it take for the church to wake up?
They sought to do the same thing that senior church leaders in the diocese we investigated have done for decades. Bury the sexual abuse by priests upon children and cover it up forever.
Now the retired Pope Benedict blames it all on homosexual cliques in the church. The same man who once slapped me on the hand for asking why he wasn't doing more to help victims.
You guys just don't get it, you know?
And we'll hear from one of the church's staunchest supporters who says there is no crisis. It's all a myth.
We live in a time of hyperventilation, of where everything is overheated.
Plus our shout out for the student reporters at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida.
These budding journalists remind us of the media's unwavering commitment to bearing witness, even in the most wrenching of circumstances.
From the Law and Crime Network studios in New York City, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, Holy Week, the most solemn week of the Christian religion. A week that has already seen the devastating fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. But it is a week that ends in a celebration of resurrection, and already hundreds of millions of dollars has been pledged to rebuild and to restore the cathedral, to repair the damage. But for the Catholic Church, there is another kind of damage that is proving much more difficult to repair. The ongoing damage caused by decades of sexual abuse by priests against children, abuse that law enforcement officials around the world allege has been ignored or covered up by senior Vatican officials. Now the FBI, federal grand juries, and state attorneys general are conducting the kinds of investigations the church failed to do. This year alone, two of the highest-ranking Vatican officials, cardinals, were implicated in sexual abuse cases. Cardinal George Pell of Australia, convicted of the sexual abuse of choir boys, sentenced to 6 years in prison. The Vatican has yet to take any action against Cardinal Pell, who once handled Vatican finances, considered the third highest-ranking church official in the world. And Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., defrocked, expelled from the church for sexually abusing minors over decades. Across the United States, law enforcement officials are digging back decades to document the sexual abuse that went unchecked, unpunished.
They sought to do the same thing that senior church leaders in the diocese we investigated have done for decades. Bury the sexual abuse by priests upon children and cover it up forever.
The Attorney General of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, issued the most damning report so far, implicating some 300 predatory priests involving more than 1,000 victims.
Father Ed Graff told a 7th grader he abused that what they were doing was okay because the priest was an instrument of God. Monsignor Thomas Benestad made a 9-year-old give him oral sex, then rinsed the boy's mouth out with holy water to purify him. These children, surrounded by adults enabling their abuse, were taught that this abuse was not only normal, but that it was holy.
Tonight, one of those victims from Pennsylvania joins us in our studio, SHAUN DOUGHERTY. SHAUN, thank you for being here. We're also joined via Skype from Chicago by Zach Heiner, the executive director of a victims' rights support group called SNAP. And SHAUN, let me start with you. You were on the stage there when the Attorney General made his announcement. What was the emotion like for you as you watched that?
It was incredible. It was a moment that I literally have been waiting my entire adult life for my story and the stories of all the other victims on that stage to finally be released to the world, and to have a state official stand in the full capacity of their job to defend us.
When that finally happened, did you feel people finally believed you?
Absolutely. That report is the vindication that we all have waited for, that something to hang our hat on for people to believe.
Zach Heiner in Chicago, this is happening around the country, state after state, exposing decades of abuse. What's been the impact on victims, on survivors, really?
You know, in our organization, we have seen a lot of people come forward as a result of the investigations, both Attorney General Shapiro's and the 17 that have started since that investigation came forward. I think this is really, as Sean said, a vindication of the experiences that survivors have gone through, and a chance for the public to really see these stories in their full breadth and detail, and recognize the reality of these situations and the fact that it is nationwide.
And are you getting and hearing from more people who are alleging they also were abused? And are there recent cases?
We are hearing from people every single time that things happen, such as a diocese releasing list or a new investigation gets announced. And yes, there are current cases that are being released. We've heard of one today in California, a 22-year-old woman out there. There's cases ongoing in the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston as well. So this is a current problem and one that needs addressing.
Sean, you recently confronted the now defrocked priest who you say abused you as a 10-year-old boy, Reverend George Koharchik, and you allowed CBS News correspondent Nikki Batiste to set up undercover cameras and record the encounter. Let's watch this.
CBS News set up hidden cameras.
What's up, George? How you doing? Have a seat. How you doing? I don't know if Brian's ready to shake yet. All right, have a seat. So we'll try to make this as least awkward as possible, I guess.
Just I'm certainly sorry for any harm I've caused and ashamed of anything that I did back then.
So Sean, he says he was sorry. Is that enough?
For me, him coming to just sit and meet with me was enough. I forgave him a long time ago. The importance of that confrontation for me, for my friend Brian that was with me, was more for the victim survivor family, to show survivors that you can gain control back over your abuser. You can take your life back. And along with that report that the Attorney General, now no one, absolutely no one in the world can say that I was not abused by Father George Koharchik.
Sean, we've got a question for you from our control room from executive producer Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
There have been so many cases, but most of these priests seem to have gone unpunished. Do you think more should be in jail? Should there be harsher consequences? What do you
Absolutely.
think?
We're fighting every day in Pennsylvania to totally eliminate the criminal statutes of limitations on crimes, sex crimes committed against minor children. And we would like to fully eliminate the statutes of limitations on civil litigation as well, as most victims, it is said from the CDC reports, that most victims of childhood sex abuse don't come forward before the age of 52.
But for you, you'd still like to see him behind bars.
Absolutely. And for me, for my case, I will never be able to charge him criminally, as the United States Supreme Court has ruled that unconstitutional. However, if someone is out there right now that could still be in the statutes of limitation, if someone was sexually active with George Koharchik in the early 90s and early 2000s, we can still criminally charge George Koharchik.
You know, we asked for comment from the U.S. Cardinal Sean O'Malley, now leading the church's own investigation of this country, but he declined to come on our program, citing the scheduling conflict of Holy Week. Later, we will hear from the head of the Catholic League, which claims there is no crisis in the church and reports of widespread abuse are a myth. But clearly there is a problem at the very top of the Vatican. Pope Francis convened a convocation of cardinals to address the issue earlier this year, but some in the church said the Pope's effort to help was a failure, that he failed to understand the scope or nature of the problem. And that was underscored earlier this month when the retired Pope Benedict addressed the issue of sexual abuse, blaming it on the sexual revolution of the 1960s and what he called homosexual cliques inside the church. Before he became Pope Benedict, he was Cardinal Ratzinger, who was accused then by victims of stalling investigations of sexual abuse at the Vatican, leading to this now infamous moment when I was a correspondent at ABC News and confronted him and got slapped on the hand by an exasperated cardinal.
There's a question whether you...
But come to me when the moment is given, not yet.
Well, we tried to ask you questions.
That approach, angry to even be asked about the problem, is emblematic, according to one of the men who has spent decades trying to get justice from the Vatican with little to show for it. John Paul Lennon, now living in Guatemala.
You guys just don't get it, it's because in a sense they're always trying to protect the church. They have to let down their guard. Otherwise they'll never understand, and otherwise there never would be real changes in the Catholic Church.
So Sean and Zach, what will it take for the church to get it, as John Paul Lennon said? Zach?
I think that society is dragging the church towards getting it a lot more. In the zeitgeist that we're in now, in the Me Too movement era that we're in, I think people across our country are certainly more awakened to the realities of sexual violence, just how common this crime occurs, and that it is, in fact, is perpetrated by people who are in positions of authority and trust. And I think that we are just so much further ahead of this issue than church hierarchs and church officials. So I think that the more that Catholics who are currently in the pews speak out against what's going on, the more that people are making noise, and the more that people begin to listen to and believe survivors like Sean and hear their stories and learn from them, that's what's going to make the church change. It's secular outside pressure.
But Sean, do you see the church still in a defensive crouch about this?
Oh, absolutely. They're spending massive amounts of lobby dollars to keep the legislation down. I would echo what Zach said, and through that movement in the pews, that is finally going to put pressure on the politicians, because right now the church hierarchy has more pressure on the politicians than the citizens of Pennsylvania, and that is changing by the minute in Pennsylvania.
But you think the church is actually lobbying to prevent the law from being expanded so victims could come forward now and bring criminal prosecution?
There's no thinking about it. It's fact. The Pennsylvania Catholic Conference of Bishops has a lobbying arm of their conference, and they are using it and wielding it heavily in Harrisburg at the Capitol.
And that law change is pivotal, you think, to making this really become...
Absolutely, especially the critical 2-year look-back window for people like me. Those depositions, those civil cases, the information that we will learn from those trials will save future generations of children.
Shaun Daugherty and Zach Heiner, thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. When we come back, the church's staunch defender, the president of the Catholic League, who says it's all a myth.
We live in a time of hyperventilation, where everything is overheated.
We're back now with the president of the Catholic League, Bill Donahue. Mr. Donahue, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
On this Holy Week, I want to ask you some questions about a problem the church has had to deal with for decades now,
Right.
and that is of sexual abuse. You have written, there is no crisis, and much of this is a myth. What in the world do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is this. But if you take a look at the John Jay study on this, the timeline where most of these problems occurred was 65 to 85. It's not as though we don't have any problems today, but we're down in the single digits. That is to say, you got about 40,000. Well, if you throw in the deacons who are clergymen with the priests, you have around 50,000 clergymen in the United States. We're down to single digits of an credible accusation made in the last 10 years.
But you don't deny there's been a problem.
There's been a huge problem.
Thousands of victims.
60s, 70s, and 80s.
Right.
We don't have the crisis in the United States today. That's long over.
Well, isn't it a crisis, though, that it hasn't really been addressed, that there's been an attempt to cover this up, essentially?
Well, certainly, Brian, you're right. If the timeline is earlier, what the church did in the 70s was a disgrace, particularly in the seminaries. Indefensible. And in the 1980s, not much better. They began to turn the corner a little bit later. See, the bill came due in 2002 when the Boston Globe came out with its report. That was about the damage that occurred earlier. So what I'm saying is this: when you had the Dallas reforms there in 2002, when they made a lot of changes in the Catholic Church, if you take a look at the incidences per year, They're minuscule. I don't know of a single institution in society today which has a better situation with the sexual abuse of minors today than the Catholic Church.
Do you think the church has handled this appropriately?
I think they've done a very good job in the United States. That's why we're down into the single digits.
Single digits meaning what?
Meaning like the average number of credible accusations made against the priest out of 50,000 with the deacons is around the area of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 a year.
We're still coming to terms with the thousands of sexual abuse cases.
Well, listen,
decades past.
For example, the Pennsylvania grand jury report from last year.
More than 300 members of the church.
Right. Do you know that almost every one of them are either dead or out of ministry? They just had 395 priests mentioned in Illinois for the whole state.
But do you feel
394 of them are dead or out of ministry.
Well, it's not the time to ignore it, though, is it? You have to come to terms with this if you're going to.
Well, I think what you might be getting at is that a lot of Catholics are angry, certainly myself, when you find out we still don't have the answers, do we, to Theodore McCarrick. Why was he promoted out of New Jersey to become an archbishop and then a cardinal in Washington, D.C.? He was a predator, and we still don't have the answers. Some people knew, and they didn't tell. So to that extent, there is a big problem. We want to find out.
But that is a scandal, isn't it?
Absolutely. It makes me angry. I'm defending the church, but let me tell you something. I don't defend the church's wrongdoers. I'm here to defend the church against wrongdoing. And I'm not going to be the church's water boy. I was correctly quoted in the New York Times a number of years ago. I'm not going to defend the indefensible. I am simply saying, yes, of course there's been a problem in the Catholic Church, and it's ongoing in other parts of the world today. In the United States, to say that we haven't made great strides, I think is simply, that is a myth.
Well, we asked Cardinal O'Malley to appear here today.
Right.
He can't because of Holy Week, but he said, his spokesman said, we don't think it's a myth. We think there's a crisis.
Well, he's entitled to if he has problems there in his seminaries, which he does, I hope he cleans it up.
But he disagrees with what you said?
Well, he can say what he wants. Look, you know what it is? A lot of Catholics lack the guts to come out and say what I'm saying. We've made tremendous progress. They don't want to offend people by saying, oh my God, are you trying to say, shove it under the rug? All I'm simply saying is I'm a social scientist. I have a doctorate in sociology. I look at the data. When we find out that the number of credible accusations against priests over the last 12, 13, 14 years is minuscule, if people want to say we still have a problem, well, they can go ahead and make their argument. And then tell me that my data are wrong, which is not my data. That's the bishop's data, and he's one of the bishops, by the way.
Pope Benedict has written recently, and you supported him. He blames it on the sexual revolution of the 60s and talks about homosexual cliques.
Look, you've got two things here, I would say, as a sociologist. You have to look at the external and the internal. You can't look at the situation in a social vacuum. Obviously, if it took place between 65 and 85, what was going on then in the West? The sexual revolution. Yes, corruption within the church, but that followed the same thinking. They were teaching in the seminaries that every sexual act was okay, including deviant sexual acts in many of the seminaries in the 1970s.
But they were never teaching that pedophilia was okay.
Oh, yes, they were, and I can prove it to you.
They were teaching that it was okay to abuse young boys.
I am telling you that there's not a single sexual deviant act, and I'll give you the name of the book. It's called Human Sexuality by Anthony Kosnick, Kosnik. People should read it. He's a former priest. The book, Human Sexuality by Crooks and Bauer. Read what they say. There's not a sexual act that they couldn't defend, and it was taught in the seminaries in the 1970s. That's one of the reasons. Now, look, if you're a normal guy and you get some crackpot priest telling seminarians that every form of sexual expression is equal, the average guy is not going to go out and act on it. But what if you have a problem to begin with?
It's still a crime to have sexually abused a child.
Oh, listen, if you had the Bill Donahue rule, I would have thrown them out a long time ago. I have done something a lot of these priests and bishops have never done. I've reported police to the authority when I was 25, and I didn't need anybody from the Catholic Church to tell me that it was wrong. I think these bishops who didn't report it, and what happened in Boston, by the way, why was Boston the epicenter where O'Malley's at? I'll tell you why. It fits in with the argument of Benedict and Bill Donahue. That's where the sexual revolution really took place. They let everybody do whatever they want. Gagan, Shanley, Porter, you can go right down. Paul Shanley in particular. And he was protected by Cardinal Law. He was protected by Cardinal Banderas. Oh, yeah, it didn't happen in Mississippi. It happened in Boston.
Bill Donahue, president of the Catholic League, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, our shout out. some remarkable journalists still in high school and what they did to persevere. Our shout out tonight to all the reporters who this week were awarded Pulitzer Prizes, and for the Pulitzer Committee itself, which this year chose to honor a select group of reporters who did not win.
Before I announce who they are, I want to break with tradition and offer my sincere admiration for an entry that did not win, but that should give us all hope for the future of journalism in this great democracy. The entry is from the staff of the Eagle Eye student newspaper at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, which submitted the obituaries of 17 coaches and classmates who were killed during a tragic shooting in their school in February 2018. The Eagle Eye submission stated that the student reporters and editors had to, quote, put aside our grief and recognize our role as both survivors, journalists, and loved ones of the deceased, end quote. These budding journalists remind us of the media's unwavering commitment to bearing witness, even in the most wrenching of circumstances, in service to a nation whose very existence depends on a free and dedicated press. There is hope in their example, even as security threats to journalists are greater than ever. And there is hope, even if some wrongly degrade the media as the enemy of the very democracy it serves. Of course the press will endure, because as the Founding Fathers knew well, there can be no democracy without it. That is something Rebecca Smith, Wendy Winters, Rob Hyacin, Gerald Fishman, and John McNamara understood too. They understood it when they went to work last June at the Capital Gazette in Annapolis, Maryland, and were gunned down by a madman who opened fire in their newsroom. It is what Jamal Khashoggi understood as well when he bravely wrote Truth to Power at the Washington Post before being murdered in October 2018 inside the Saudi consulate in Turkey. In all, 63 professional journalists worldwide were killed this year, according to Reporters Without Borders. That is a 15% increase in journalists who lost their lives for simply trying to do their jobs. In their spirit, this year's winning work reflects yet again a steely resolve in upholding the highest principles and ideals of this noble profession.
A sobering and important reminder. That's our program for this week. We'll see you back here again next week. Good night.